Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into a step-by-step theological framework for daily spiritual discipline, and we're anchoring this entirely on one foundational concept, everything God said in our source text. We're going to break down a really fascinating roadmap that takes us from that frustrating place of repeated failure right into a sustainable daily practice of faith. So if you've ever felt like spiritual discipline is just this impossible uphill battle, well, This Explainer is going to lay out the exact mechanics of how to flip the script on that.
We kick things off with a pretty stark warning, acting like a blaring alarm bell to wake us up to the reality of judgment. Now, the source points out that a lot of folks try to soften this message today, but honestly, it's an absolutely crucial first step. I mean, think about it. If someone's house is literally on fire, you don't whisper sweet nothings to them, right? You yell, "Get out!" This quote is exactly that. It's alerting us to the fire. It's meant to instill this necessary fear that completely shatters our comfort zone and forces us to look at the fatal trajectory of living in sin.
Okay, let's take a quick look at the agenda. 1, fleeing the burning house. 2, recognizing complete vulnerability. 3, the spiritual survival diet. 4, the pray first principle. And finally, 5, forgiveness 70 times 7. Let's get right into it. Section 1, fleeing the burning house. So phase 1 is all about recognizing that immediate danger and taking decisive action. Now, this perfectly highlights the dynamic at play here. Fear is absolutely necessary to get you out of that burning house of sin, but only an intimate relationship is going to sustain your journey long term. You see, the fear of judgment is incredibly effective at making you drop those destructive habits and sprint out the front door. But here's the catch. Fear has a really short shelf life. Once you're out on the front lawn shivering in the cold, fear isn't going to keep you warm. You simply cannot build a lifelong spiritual foundation on terror alone. So to stay out of that burning house permanently, you have to transition immediately from fear into a deep relational walk. And when we look closely at everything God said about this, a relationship fundamentally requires agreement. That means any attempt to walk with God is completely in vain if you deliberately choose to stay in that burning house. It's like, well, you can't hold hands with God while simultaneously clinging to the exact things He's calling you away from. The speaker makes it crystal clear. Jumping straight into trying to have a close relationship without first abandoning the sin, it's basically a paradox. You've got to agree with the judgment on the sin to actually walk the path. Section 2, recognizing our complete vulnerability. Moving to the next stage, the speaker outlines this really deep frustration that almost always hits right after leaving that house. You've agreed, you've stepped outside, and now the real struggle begins. Just look at this incredibly relatable, hopeless cycle. You hear the message, you get all fired up, you grit your teeth and tell yourself, I'm never going to gossip again, or I'm never going to lie again. And then 2 or 3 days pass and boom, you fall right back into the exact same sin. The speaker actually shares their own testimony of living in this precise loop, just feeling completely powerless and trapped in this spiritual prison. And you know, it's usually right here that negative thoughts swoop in to whisper that you should probably just give up. But here is the crucial pivot point. To break that cycle, you have to recognize this profound vulnerability and just admit that you are entirely too weak to overcome it on your own. That frustration you felt in the previous steps, it isn't a sign that you're doomed. Actually, it's the prerequisite for grace. A healthy person doesn't go looking for a doctor, right? If you genuinely think you can conquer your habits with just sheer willpower, you'll never lean on a savior. You have to hit that absolute wall of total powerlessness to realize you need a real intervention. The framework emphasizes that human willpower is just never enough. And this isn't some pessimistic view of humanity. It's an objective theological baseline. Because human nature is inherently drawn toward falling short, relying on ourselves is literally a mathematical guarantee of failure. We have to completely shift our dependency away from our own strength, which leads us right into the daily commands required for actual spiritual survival. Section 3, the spiritual survival diet. So if willpower doesn't work, what actually does? Let's talk about feeding the soul. This is where the framework really comes together. The speaker points out that relying on yesterday's prayer leaves your spiritual body completely starved today, exactly like how relying on yesterday's lunch leaves you physically weak. Honestly, this is probably the most practical takeaway of the whole explainer. Think about it. You would never say, well, I drank a huge glass of water in 2022, so I don't know why I'm so thirsty today in 2023, right? No way. Yet we do this spiritually all the time. We ride the high of an amazing prayer from 3 days ago and then wonder why we're caving to temptation today. Spiritual sustenance metabolizes exactly like physical food. It requires fresh, daily intake. In everything God said about endurance, we are explicitly instructed to take this journey exactly one day at a time. That way, you don't get completely overwhelmed stressing over how you're going to resist temptation for the next 20 years. When you stare at the mountain of a lifetime of holiness, it's paralyzing. But the speaker highlights that spiritual endurance is specifically designed to be portioned out in 24-hour increments. You don't need the grace today to overcome next year's temptations. You only need the grace to maintain that relationship until your head hits the pillow tonight. Section 4. The Pray First Principle. Now, to handle today's worries, the source introduces a highly practical, absolutely non-negotiable daily routine. This is where the rubber meets the road. Notice how a super busy schedule is structured entirely around this deliberate principle from morning to evening. It ensures that spiritual survival is the absolute top priority. Look, if you put prayer at the very bottom of your daily to-do list, it only gets whatever leftover scraps of energy you have, which, let's be real, is usually zero. The framework insists that whether you have to set your alarm extra early or literally pause in your car the second you get home from work, you have to adopt the rule of, let me pray first. It's a deliberate, conscious priority that essentially sets the armor for the entire timeline of your day. And prioritizing this time brings actual, tangible power. Why? Because spiritual forces and negative habits must yield and grant you victory for that specific day. When you apply the pray first principle, you aren't just sitting there meditating, you are actively confronting your specific struggles. The speaker notes that if you lean into this authority, it forces that particular temptation to bow. It grants you victory. But, and this is a big but, remember, it only grants you victory for today. Tomorrow, you've got to wake up and claim it all over again. Now, if you're sitting there thinking, I wouldn't even know what to say, the advice here is incredibly straightforward. Just specifically name your weaknesses, ask for strength against temptation, ask for a changed heart, and listen for correction. You absolutely do not need eloquent, fancy religious vocabulary. If you're struggling to pray, the speaker literally says to just verbalize your struggles as if you're talking to a close friend. Just say, Lord, I don't know how to pray right now, please help me. Tell him you really want to stop a specific habit, but you just keep failing. It's an honest, raw diagnostic of your spiritual health, and that's exactly what's needed. Section 5. Forgiveness 70 times 7. As we reach the final stage, let's talk about getting back up. Because even with the absolute best diet and schedule, human beings are inevitably going to stumble along this narrow path. But the instruction to forgive others 70 times 7 mathematically illustrates an infinite, relentless willingness to forgive us when we fall, provided we stand back up and humble ourselves. 490 isn't some literal cutoff point. It's a symbolic representation of endless grace. The speaker stresses that the enemy loves to use a moment of failure to convince you that you've blown your chances forever. But everything God said proves the exact opposite. Now, he obviously doesn't want us taking advantage of mercy, but if we quickly humble ourselves, shut the door on that sin, and get right back up, that forgiveness is waiting. The speaker concludes that living at the Savior's feet every single day is exactly what staying connected to the vine looks like. And when you do that, a holy life becomes a natural byproduct rather than this exhausting, white-knuckled effort. Think about a tree. A branch doesn't strain and sweat and stress to produce an apple, right? It simply stays attached to the tree, and the tree pushes all the right nutrients through to create the fruit. When you practice this daily dependence, recognizing your vulnerability and praying first, you are staying attached. The holiness you've been so desperately trying to force through willpower, it eventually just becomes an automatic outcome of the time spent remaining connected. So, as we wrap up this explainer, we want to leave you with a final thought to examine your own routines. We wouldn't even dream of starving our physical bodies, yet our spiritual health is so often neglected. Based on the framework of everything God said, your victory tomorrow depends entirely on the spiritual nourishment you seek today. Take a hard look at your schedule, evaluate your daily spiritual diet, and ask yourself, what did you feed your spiritual body today? Thanks so much for joining me, and I really encourage you to genuinely reflect on that as you go about your day.